The most brutal human experiments in history. War often brings out the worst in humanity. But some stories go far beyond the battlefield. Stories so horrifying, so inhumane, that they're almost too dark to believe. This is one of those stories. Today, we're diving into the terrifying history of Unit 731, Japan's secret World War II biological warfare unit responsible for some of the most gruesome human experiments ever conducted. What happened behind those guarded walls in Manchuria remains one of the darkest secrets of modern history. And what's worse, it was all covered up for decades. Origins of Unit 731. Unit 731 was born in the 1930s, during Japan's aggressive expansion into China. The Japanese military occupied Manchuria, a region in northeastern China, and renamed it Manchukuo. In 1936, under the command of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a highly ambitious army doctor and microbiologist, Unit 731 was established in Pingfang, just outside Harbin. The official purpose? To develop defensive capabilities against biological warfare. The truth? It was a facility built for mass human experimentation. With massive funding from the Imperial Japanese Army and full government backing, Ishii created what he called a research center. In reality, it was a death camp. The victims. The people experimented on were mostly Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, but they also included Koreans, Mongolians, and even a few Russians. These victims were often referred to as Maruta, meaning logs, as if they were not human beings, but mere objects for experimentation. Estimates vary, but historians believe over 300,000 people may have died due to Unit 731's actions. Many were kidnapped from the streets, their families never knowing what happened to them. Some were prisoners handed over by Japanese military forces. Others were arrested for minor offenses or as political enemies. Horrific experiments. So, what actually happened inside Unit 731? The experiments were not just unethical, they were unspeakably cruel. Surgery without anesthesia, victims were cut open alive without anesthesia to study the effects of disease on internal organs. Researchers would infect a person with a disease and then dissect them while alive to observe its progression. Men, women, and even pregnant women were subjected to these procedures. Frostbite testing. To study how soldiers might survive in cold conditions, subjects were exposed to freezing temperatures. Their limbs were dunked in ice water until frozen solid. Then doctors would strike the limbs with sticks to test the damage, or simply amputate them for study. Biological Weapons Testing Unit 731 developed plague bombs, cholera bombs, and devices to spread typhoid and anthrax. These were tested directly on live humans. Victims were deliberately infected, sometimes locked in sealed rooms while gases or biological agents were pumped in. Others were tied to stakes in open fields, where bombs filled with infected fleas were dropped to test their effects. Rape and forced pregnancy. Female prisoners were repeatedly raped by guards or assigned to male prisoners to create pregnancies. Researchers wanted to study the transmission of disease from mother to fetus. Pregnant women were then vivisected, along with their unborn babies. Weapon testing victims were used to test grenades, flamethrowers, and even bayonets. Live individuals were tied up as test subjects. Other experiments included dehydration to death, air pressure chambers, blood drainage, and starvation. The scale and cover-up Unit 731 wasn't just a single lab. It was a vast operation with over 150 buildings in the Pingfang district. It employed more than 3,000 scientists, doctors, and military personnel. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the unit's leaders destroyed as much evidence as they could. Victims were executed, records burned, buildings blown up. But the most shocking part? The United States helped cover it up. Rather than prosecute the scientists for war crimes, American intelligence offered them immunity in exchange for their research data. The US believed that the data gathered through these inhumane experiments could be valuable in its own biological warfare programs during the Cold War. As a result, none of the senior figures from Unit 731 were ever held accountable. Shiro Ishii lived a free life until his death in 1959. Survivors and witnesses. Few survivors of Unit 731 existed, and fewer still were willing, or able, to speak out. Many had died during the experiments. However, In later decades, whistleblowers and lower-level personnel began to break their silence. One former employee described watching a young Chinese boy being dissected alive. Another recalled testing plague bombs on villages. In the 1980s and 1990s, survivors and family members began demanding justice. Public testimony in Japan and China brought the issue back into the spotlight. In 1997, a lawsuit was filed in Tokyo by 180 Chinese plaintiffs seeking compensation. But the Japanese courts dismissed the case, stating that no individual reparations could be made for acts during wartime. Legacy and modern implications. The legacy of Unit 731 still haunts East Asia. In China, it remains a symbol of Japanese war atrocities. A museum now stands at the site in Harbin, where the public can learn about the horrors committed there. But in Japan, the topic is still sensitive. Textbooks often omit or downplay Unit 731. Politicians avoid the topic. Some even deny it. Meanwhile, scholars argue that the US government's decision to grant immunity set a dangerous precedent, one where war crimes can be ignored if the perpetrators have something to offer. Unit 731 also raises ethical questions still relevant today. Can data gathered through unethical means ever be justified? What happens when science serves military ambition instead of humanity? Science turned into a weapon. What made Unit 731 especially terrifying wasn't just the brutality. It was the fact that science was the weapon. These were not untrained butchers. Many were top Japanese scientists, doctors, and military surgeons. They kept meticulous notes. They documented every infection, every autopsy, every reaction. Science, typically a tool for healing, was perverted to serve destruction, and all under the banner of national progress and military superiority. In many ways, Unit 731 represents a worst-case scenario. What happens when scientists lose all ethical constraints and are given absolute power over helpless victims? And perhaps most disturbing, this wasn't unique to Japan. Parallels to Nazi Germany. Around the same time, the world witnessed another horror: the Nazi experiments in concentration camps across Europe. Just like Unit 731, Nazi doctors like Joseph Mengele conducted experiments on twins, pregnant women, and the mentally ill, all under the pretense of research. The Nuremberg trials, after the war, tried and executed many Nazi doctors. The result was the creation of the Nuremberg Code in 1947, a set of ethical principles for human experimentation. But there was no equivalent trial for Unit 731. Why? Because geopolitics took precedence over justice. The Cold War had begun, and America feared that the Soviet Union might gain access to Japan's biological warfare research. So, the US made a devil's bargain. Let the scientists go free in exchange for their data. Secret for decades. For decades after World War II, the full truth of Unit 731 remained hidden from the public. Japanese textbooks ignored it. US intelligence buried it. Survivors were silenced. The name Shiro Ishii disappeared from public memory. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that independent historians, journalists, and survivors began to break the silence. Declassified US documents revealed the deal made with Unit 731 scientists. Chinese families began coming forward. Former guards spoke out. Documentaries, books, and lawsuits followed. In 2002, the International Symposium on Unit 731 brought global attention to the horrors, but justice still out of reach. Modern-day impact. Why does this matter today? Because the misuse of science hasn't ended. In the decades since Unit 731, there have been countless bioethics violations. The Tuskegee syphilis study in the US, where black men were denied treatment just to study the disease's effects. The forced sterilizations of women in various countries. Unethical vaccine testing in developing nations. Denial and responsibility. Even today, Japan's government has not formally acknowledged Unit 731 or apologized for its crimes. Some Japanese politicians and nationalists continue to deny or minimize what happened, claiming the unit was for defense research only. Meanwhile, survivors' families continue to fight for recognition. Chinese museums preserve evidence. International scholars continue to demand accountability. But with each passing year, witnesses die, and history risks being erased. As global citizens, we all share a responsibility to speak truth, to demand transparency, and to never allow history's darkest chapters to be rewritten by those in power. Prisoners of Unit 731, Human Experiments Beyond Imagination. When we hear the word experiment, we often think of sterile labs, microscopes, and scientists in white coats. But inside the icy corridors of Unit 731, experiment meant something far more sinister. Here, the subjects were not volunteers. They were prisoners, civilians, dissidents, soldiers, men, women, and even children abducted from Chinese villages, Korean towns, and Russian settlements. The Japanese military had a code name for these prisoners, Maruta, meaning logs. To them, these human beings were no different than wood to be cut, burned, and disposed of. Frostbite experiments. In the icy winters of Manchuria, prisoners were forced to endure temperatures as low as 20 degrees Celsius. Their limbs were doused with water and exposed to the cold until frozen solid. Scientists then struck the limbs with sticks or blunt instruments to test if the skin had reached crunch stage. Once frozen, the limbs were thawed, either naturally or in boiling water, to observe the effects of tissue death, gangrene, and necrosis. Amputations often followed, without painkillers, while the prisoners screamed in agony or remained silent from shock. Disease Weaponization Unit 731 wasn't just studying disease, they were turning it into a weapon. Prisoners were deliberately infected with bubonic plague, typhus, syphilis, anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera. Some were injected with diseases to see how quickly symptoms developed. Others were forced to have sexual intercourse with infected individuals to study STD transmission. Entire prison cells were sealed and filled with aerosolized bacteria to observe mass infection patterns. Pressure chambers and weapon testing. In the underground labs of Pingfang, pressure chambers were used to simulate high altitudes. Prisoners were placed inside and subjected to increasing pressure until their eardrums burst. Their eyes popped out, and they bled from every orifice. Some were burned alive with flamethrowers. Others were shot at varying ranges to test bullet wounds. Biological bombs were detonated around chained prisoners to measure blast effects and shrapnel damage. Even grenade wounds were mapped to identify which organs were hit, how long survival lasted, and how infection spread. Pregnant women and children. Unit 731's brutality knew no limits. Pregnant women were not spared. Many were forcibly impregnated, some through rape, to allow fetal development to be studied. Later, both mother and fetus were dissected alive, just to observe the effects of infection on unborn babies. Children were used in starvation tests, locked in cages and denied food for weeks. Others were injected with chemical agents or forced to inhale poisonous gases. Cherry blossoms at night. Japan's plan to bomb the US with plague. In 1945, as the Pacific War reached its climax, Japan's military developed a horrifying plan called Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. The strategy? Send kamikaze pilots and submarines to the US West Coast, particularly San Diego, and unleash plague-infected fleas in residential areas. Unit 731 would supply the biological weapons. The plan was postponed multiple times due to Japan's weakening naval power. It was finally scheduled for September 22, 1945. But on August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. If they hadn't, this biological 9/11 might have changed American history forever. Newly released archives. Japan's Secret Scientist Registry in 2018, the Japanese government finally released the names of over 3,600 scientists and staff who worked at Unit 731 and related facilities. Among them were not just military doctors, but also university professors, chemists, and engineers, many of whom went on to have prestigious post-war careers. Some became medical school deans. Others worked in government. None were ever prosecuted. Their names were buried in files marked classified for over 70 years. The release sparked outrage among historians and survivors' families, but it also confirmed what many feared. War criminals became educators, and the world let it happen. The Immunity Bargain, the US cover-up. After Japan's surrender, American intelligence officers raced to reach Unit 731 before the Soviets. They made a chilling deal. In exchange for all Unit 731's data, the US would grant immunity to every member, including General Shiro Ishii. The data was deemed too valuable to destroy or ignore. This information, gained through torture and death, was quietly shipped to Fort Detrick, the U.S. Army's Biological Warfare Facility in Maryland. There, it formed the basis of America's own bioweapons program during the Cold War. No war crimes charges, no international trials, just silence and buried secrets. The story of Unit 731 is not just a story of war. It's a story of how science can be twisted into savagery, how governments bury the truth, and how victims are forgotten in the name of progress. For decades, what happened in the icy labs of Harbin was denied, hidden, and ignored by Japan, by the West, even by the institutions that inherited its dark knowledge. No war crimes trial, no apology, no justice. The men behind these atrocities died in peace. The victims? They died in pain, in silence, and for many, without names. Like this video so the algorithm doesn't bury the truth. Subscribe to this channel for more hidden histories.